Good to go.
Good to go. Well, hello, everyone. This is Rocco Pisto, your host for Michigan Watercolor Society's Art Talk. And today we have a special guest, Peter Gooch, or should I say Professor Peter Gooch, or Professor Emeritus Peter Gooch.
Or just old Peter Gooch.
Or old Peter Gooch. And been looking forward to this conversation. I'm letting people in as we go along here. Peter was at Eastern Michigan when a number of us were there in Kingsley Calkins's advanced watercolor class. And so I had a chance to meet him back then, and the name always stuck. And Peter was pretty active with Michigan Watercolor, and we'll talk about that as well. So before we get started, I've got a few announcements to make. First of all, I want to thank everyone that submitted in this year's 76th annual exhibition. We'll be sending out, as soon as we get everything cleaned up, we'll be sending it out to the juror here pretty soon to pick the top 60 out of 180 some paintings for this year's annual exhibition at Hope College at the Krasinga Museum in Holland this year. The workshop information with our juror will come in as well here shortly. We'll be doing the workshop at Hope College in the art department. So that's going to be neat, just like going back to college. Everyone should be getting a donation letter from Michigan Watercolor to donate to support our awards and all those kind of things. So, if you feel like donating, please do. We need the money to, to keep these awards up. Last year was kind of a banner year since it was our 75th annual. We gave out about $8,000 worth of awards, which was a lot for us, but I don't think we'll be doing that this year. And if you enjoy these art talks, like we had one with Edie Jopik a few weeks ago, and others that you'll find in our YouTube channel, the Michigan Watercolor Society YouTube channel, feel free to suggest people that you think would be of interest to us as a group to hear their story. And in the process, since it's being recorded, it's kind of going into our archives of videos of people that, I think were important to the group. So think about that. Just you can send things to me. I'm sure everyone's got my email address. But Peter, thank you for joining. We were trying to do this in December, and you were dealing with some health issues. So we pushed it back, and it looks like you're doing great.
Still upright and semi-lucid.
No, that's great. So let's, I want to just read a little bio, Peter Gooch, for those that don't know him or never heard of him. But Peter was born in 1947 in Ann Arbor. He graduated from University High School in 65, entered the University of Michigan in 65. And then in 67, he accompanied his dad to India and Nepal on a grant from the University of Michigan. In 68, he enlisted in the Air Force. And then in 73 through 78, he attended Eastern Michigan, where he received a Bachelor's of Science in English Literature and a Bachelor's of Fine Arts. And in 83, he enrolled in a Master's of Fine Art program at Western Michigan University, received his degree in 85. After teaching part-time at Eastern for a year, he moved to Dayton, Ohio to teach at the University of Dayton. And I think that's where you spent your collegiate career teaching-wise. He served on the board of the Ann Arbor Art Association and the Michigan Watercolor Society. He was awarded an Ohio Individual Awards Fellowship as well, summer research, some other things at the University of Dayton. and his work can be found in public collections, including the University of Michigan Museum of Art and numerous other places. So that's Peter Gooch. Peter, any comments before we get started?
Yeah, well, first of all, yeah, the bios is very accurate. And I wanted to, before we start with questions and so forth, just thank you for the amazing job that you've done with the Watercolor Society and for doing this kind of thing, which of course, back in the old days when I was involved with them, there was no such thing as Zoom or anything like that. So, but I think the publicity, and the energy, and the innovations that you brought to the Watercolor Society are really impressive. And I'm really glad you're doing this. I know it must take a tremendous amount of time, out of your life, but I will say that at least from my vantage, it's well worth it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, you and Paula got involved right away out of college, basically, and I couldn't at the time. And of course, at that time, I didn't know what I was doing anyway, so I wouldn't have been much use. But after 40 years in the sales world and technology and all that stuff, it seemed fitting that I'd be involved during COVID and all these things where we had to move on to electronics. But let's talk about your education. So you went to U of M, and did you study art at U of M?
No, I studied philosophy and English literature at U of M for 2 years. The summer, or actually the winter of my junior year, I accompanied Dad on a Rackham grant, which was part of his sabbatical research, to India and Nepal. He designed the trip so that we would essentially circumnavigate the planet. And so that was my junior year, as it were, and probably a better education than I could have gotten at any university.
Sure. And then you came to Eastern, and it looks like you went into English as well there as one of your degrees.
Mm-hmm.
And then,
Yeah,
and then you
I
got
was just
into
going
the
to
art
add
side.
I'm sorry. I was just going to add that when I decided to transfer to Eastern, the first thing in my mind was to do it for art. The reason I took a degree in English from Eastern was that I had so many credits from Michigan and so on. And my father and Richard Wild both recommended that I go to Eastern instead of U of M in art, although they were both U of M art faculty. And Eastern turned out to be a major kind of awakening for me, partly because the faculty, for whatever reason, were willing to talk to students. And that was not, I did not find that to be true at U of M. So I felt quite embraced from the very first semester at Eastern with Charles McGee and Richard Washington. I felt very embraced by the faculty, and that made going to school very, very different than the large sort of anonymous classes that I was doing at U of M. Although, of course, U of M was my home, and I went to high school right down on Central Campus. So it wasn't a matter of not feeling comfortable. It was a matter of simply finding a faculty that was sort of on my same wavelength.
Well, speaking of your dad, for those that don't know, Donald Gooch was one of the founding members of the Michigan Watercolor Society. And I just lost, you're there, Peter. Someone's,
I can see
there you
you.
go. There
Okay.
you go. And I want to talk to you, what was that experience like having your dad? I want to show my screen because I want to start showing some slides before we're talking. So let's see, there we go. Let's share this screen. Your dad stuff. You gave me this piece to kind of show of your dad's work what was the experience of working or living with your dad?
I'm not seeing the painting, but I certainly can tell you
It's
that
the, can anyone see the painting? Paula, can you see it?
No.
Okay, I've got sharing. Let's see if I maybe don't have the screen popped up. Uh, oh, let me know if you see it.
I'm still seeing the menu.
Okay, darn it. I'm gonna get this up here. Always something, learning as we go. You are sharing, you are screen sharing. Okay, good. That's good. Da, 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 da. Don't know why it's not sharing. That's here. Stop sharing. That brings us all back.
Okay, we're back. I can see you.
Right. Let's see. Paul is joining. Let me just see if there's any other little trick that I need. Oh, that's just share sound or video. And it should just pop right up. Participants can now see your application. Can you? Yeah, and you can't see it. View.
I can still see the menu, and I think you're clicking on the yellow house in
Right.
Fontainebleau. And I sent you that one for a couple of reasons. One pretty practical, and that is that it's a piece that I still own and is hanging in my house. But also because it's a very, very early painting that my dad did when he was studying art at the Fontainebleau School near Paris before the war. And that painting particularly reminds me of the rather different definition of watercolor that existed certainly pre-war, post-war, and up through maybe the 70s, when watercolor was considered only to be transparent work done on paper. And my dad was not at all dogmatic about rules for art, but when he painted on paper, he used very traditional materials and methods, even though I think he considered himself primarily an oil painter.
Okay. And you sent me, and boy, this really upsets me that I can't show these things, but I don't know why.
Well, that's okay. I think the images are helpful, but not necessary.
And you sent me
Disagree.
something from, his name is Lopez.
Yeah, Carlos Lopez. Mm-hmm.
And that's a watercolor as well, looks like.
Yes,
And
indeed. He was on faculty in the U of M art department and also in several places in Detroit for the post-war period up until his death in 1953. He and my dad were not only colleagues, but they were very, very close friends. So as a boy, I actually, after Carlos's death, I lived with a great many of his works because we were storing them for the Lopez family after Carlos's death. And when Rhoda Lopez moved to California with her sons.
okay. Let's see. Trying this again to see if there's any other trick that I'm missing. Because I want to talk to these pieces.
But maybe one of the more salient points would be that these were the pieces I sent you among many, many others, were works of art that I grew up with essentially from birth. They
Okay.
were all hanging in our house in Ann Arbor. And so these pieces, all of which I still own, have been with me essentially for 3/4 of a century.
Wow. And again, nobody can see these, right? They're not popping up, Peter.
I can
Not for
see
me, no.
just thumbnails of them
Okay, so that's screen.
in the folder.
Yeah, and the
See if I
one
can
on the
make
right
those
is,
bigger.
is Richard Wilt, who was a huge influence on my life and on my early work. Somebody that I admired intensely, a colleague of my father's, and in all truth, I think one of the paradigms in my world for what it was to be a painter.
Okay.
And those of you that knew Dick, if there are any, will remember him as extraordinarily short on speech, rather cryptic, but he developed a way of producing watercolor images through putting objects on wet paper and flowing paint around them. And that was something that inspired my attempts at innovation.
And did his wife teach at Eastern, Paula?
Yeah, oh, absolutely. Bonnie
Yeah.
is a great artist in her own right and a tremendous watercolorist.
I think she's
And
the one that taught us drawing.
Probably, yeah. Yeah, I never had her for a class, but I knew and liked Bonnie very much. They lived just down the hill from us in Ann Arbor. Or Bonnie did, Dick did not.
Okay.
Rocco, could you click on the thumbnails to see if they'll enlarge, or if you have more than one screen?
I have been clicking on the thumbnails and
Okay.
you guys aren't seeing it. I'm seeing it. I mean, I'm blowing these up. They're full screen for me. And you're
Okay.
not seeing it.
No, not. Do you have two monitors?
What's that? I do have two monitors, but it's everything's working off of one monitor.
Okay. All right.
So at least from my perspective.
Okay. Thanks.
Okay, let me get back here. You can't see those, but I'm going to share these images after the presentation. Yep. Since that's not working, but I'm going to bring these up. So
And,
Peter,
and in my view,
go ahead.
Go ahead. I
No,
was just going to say, in my view, the reason that I chose those particular images is simply to illustrate the traditional way watercolor was viewed around the time that the Watercolor Society was founded, even though there was there was a pretty wide range of techniques and subject matter from the founders. For the most part, and it's probably dangerous for me to try to speak for them, but at least in my recollection, for the most part, watercolor was considered, once again, as I said, transparent on paper. The traditional watercolor that you and I and Paula and numerous other people learned at Eastern under Igor Beginnin and King Calkins.
Right. And your experience, especially through your dad, of being around some of the founders, that must have been kind of a neat experience.
Yeah, for me, frankly, I thought that was normal until I got older. So they were essentially friends. And one of the great virtues of that situation, in other words, being surrounded by my father's colleagues and other members of the Ann Arbor art community, as well as Detroit art community, one of the great advantages was that I, from very early on, came to see professors as people. And what that allowed me to do was not to expect perfection from any one teacher, but rather see education as an aggregate experience. In other words, one teacher might provide one insight, another teacher might provide another, et cetera, et cetera. For instance, I never worked with Mary Jane Bigler, much to my regret, but being around her was an education in itself. And I'm sure that Marilyn Dewinskas could back me up on that. And Mary Jane was one of a type of professors that existed back in the 50s and 60s that sadly have become rare birds in today's academe. She knew a lot of stuff. She wasn't afraid to say it. She wasn't fearful of insulting anybody from the president on down, president of the university on down. And she was a very bold woman. And I think for those that were lucky enough to work with her for a prolonged period, a tremendous role model for approaching art and, in my case, academe.
And you've gone from a lot of different directions with your work. I mean, I know you've done a lot of watercolor, but you've kind of moved into more just like the piece behind you, which is more acrylic in nature, though it looks like watercolor.
Well, yeah, and in truth, Rocco, I was never all that comfortable with those hard and fast definitions of the medium. I was certainly always interested in painting, and I included watercolor right in the middle of that, category. It seemed to me always, and now one caveat is that if I make a statement, that statement is only what I believe, quote, at the moment, but also not intended to suggest any sort of universal truth. So if I say that the rules surrounding watercolor never interested me, I'm not at all suggesting, number one, that they weren't valid, number one, that they weren't a valid interest for thousands and thousands of, if not millions of people, or that anyone should not be interested in them. Only that in my experience, those rules seemed unnecessary. And I think it's always good to work within a system. It may be preferable to work within a system that's self-generated rather than generated from the outside. But systems and boundaries give you something to bounce off, to either reject or embrace or to investigate, et cetera, et cetera. So the rules that permeated the discipline of watercolor from the post-war years up through the 70s, I think I don't have any feeling about them other than I tried to embrace those that I thought applied to me and ignore totally those that I thought didn't. But in terms of the various supports that I use, the only real reason, and and both of them are very practical. The reasons that I went to working on canvas and working on panel was simply, number one, the size issue back in the day was very difficult to get watercolor paper that was huge and so on. Now, we all now work on Reeves BFK printmaking paper that comes in these huge rolls and so forth. But back when I was learning the sport, that wasn't really that available. And the other reason that I never exclusively worked on canvas and panel, I always did works on paper. But one reason to move to the different supports was very simply economic. framing watercolors or even doing it yourself was both expensive and, for me, difficult. And so if I wanted, and I know, Rocco, that you're doing some amazing things with large scale watercolor now and different supports, which I think is tremendous. We didn't have back in the day that technology. And so for me, it seemed a little bit simpler if I wanted to do a 60-inch piece or an 8-foot piece or something like that, simply to go to canvas, even though the paint I used was always water soluble. I've never worked in oils. I actually have an allergy. And so I've never thought what I did, regardless of the support, was anything other than water media, which is, I guess, the new phrase for watercolor. Everything all the paint I use is water soluble. It's very liquid. When I create the paint, I do it in a very not traditional, but in a very watercolory kind of way. And that's something that has always been native to my understanding in terms of the way paint works as a water soluble element. That was poorly said. Sorry about that. But so I've never really left watercolor at all. It's just a matter of which support do you choose to use.
Yeah, I learned that you could, with time, new elements come out, new things come out to bring watercolor painting actually back from the dead, actually. Because I had a lot of stuff from the 70s that I go, now I think I can fix things 40 years later. And because of liquid inks, India ink, which, Calkins loved back then, and I love it. Now there's white India ink, and there's, which are permanent colors. And then the French watercolor crayons that you can wash with water, but still draw with it as well on the painting. So, and again, learning how to seal watercolor paper to gator board to create that canvas-like stiffness on rolled watercolor paper. Because now you can buy it that are 25 yards long to do 6-foot, 8-foot paintings and seal them so you don't need glass, you don't need a mat. And just like the painting behind you, it comes across like an oil or acrylic, and not have to worry about damaging the arches paper.
Yeah, so, absolutely. And what technology has wrought, I think has indirectly influenced, of course, the kind of images that one is able to make and so forth. But in essence, in looking back over the course of the last 30 years or so, I would say that the best thing about the changes in paint technology is that it has made achieving what one hopes to achieve easier. I remember I worked with Sam Golden's paints for years and years and years, and I think what Golden Colors has contributed to the field of water-soluble painting is really remarkable. But when you and I were in school, that there simply weren't any golden acrylics, to use and so forth.
Now let's talk about Michigan watercolor a little bit. So,
yeah,
did you get involved from your dad just being around it, or did Calkins get you involved like he did me and Paula?
Well, absolutely. Even though my father spoke about the Watercolor Society and so forth, by the time I was moderately conscious, he wasn't entering watercolor shows or anything like that. And so it was always the people that he knew, Thad Bukowski, Bill Bostic, Mary Jane, and people like that were associated with the Watercolor Society. And I met them through his references before I ever met them personally. I got involved in the Watercolor Society based on the direct influence of Paula Zaks, Lula Nestor, and Electra Stamoulis. And we all met in King Calkins' advanced watercolor class at Eastern. And that was, in hindsight, that was quite a heady brew back then.
Yeah. No, they definitely sucked me in. And I think if anyone remembers Electra Stamoulis, they'll know that she probably ran that class more than Calkins did when she was in there.
That was her nature.
Right.
And I felt very fortunate that Electra was willing to take me under her intellectual wing and sort of explain to me in very simple terms that I could understand how things worked. And I don't simply mean painting. It was how the art world worked, how the Watercolor Society worked, et cetera, et cetera. And she, Electra was a great teacher. And it seemed to me that she could never actually stop teaching.
Yeah.
So she was a huge influence on my thinking, if not my actual painting.
Well, Peter, I was kind of going through our signature list of people, and we only had historical data back going about 10, 12 years. And I remember you were in the Michigan Watercolor Show almost every year you entered. And you were in the show the last 3 of the last 10 years, because then you just stopped entering. But if you entered one more time, you would both be a signature member as well as a Great Lakes Fellow for your board experience. But,
well, I appreciate that. I guess my laziness has done me in. But I will say, in all fairness, my wife and I have moved around a good bit. From Dayton, we moved to Northwest Ohio, where she was practicing at a hospital. And then after that, we moved to Taos, New Mexico, based on her practice. And so once I left Dayton, my great big studio, I had to close. And I had a studio in Bryan, Ohio, in a little storefront, which was pretty quaint and pretty chilly in Northwest Ohio. And then I also had a studio in Taos. And the work I completed in the 3 years in Taos has not been photographed, framed, or anything. It's been essentially in storage for the last few years. And I do have a space here in Corrales. And for those of you unfamiliar with New Mexico, which I was until we moved, Corrales is a tiny little farming community right on the flank of the giant, busy, unpleasant city of Albuquerque. We only have 2 roads. They run parallel. Top speed limit is 30 miles an hour. And we have a very active and interested police force that enforces the speed limit with great zeal. Most of the people here own horses. It's a very green spot along the Rio Grande River. And when my wife started to practice in Albuquerque and we moved from Taos, we bought a house that had what they refer to as a casita, which is a 1,000-foot space. It's a separate building, actually, from the house itself. And since that time, we have been planning to turn it into a studio. It's not plumbed or heated or anything like that. So in this climate, that presents a bit of a problem. But I really haven't painted since Taos. I'm pretty comfortable, to be honest with you. I'm pretty comfortable being retired from painting. It doesn't mean I won't paint again. I've retired twice. But right now I'm focusing my efforts on fiction, and I'm very close to polishing off my second novel, which, believe it or not, is set in the Detroit art scene of the late 70s. So I haven't really left art and painting. I've only changed my medium.
Well, speaking of that, and again, you got to let us know when that book comes out. And
I absolutely will.
We'll
Check Facebook.
Yeah, we'll definitely promote it with Michigan Watercolor. That's for sure. What was your experience? I know, I found an old picture, and again, I'm going to post all these images of Peter's artwork when I send out the recording message. But there's a picture of you on the board with Paula, Lulu, Marilyn, and then a few others that I remember from back then. And you had, of course, this was the late 70s, early 80s, so we all had a lot of hair. I have none, but but when I had it, it was thick. And yours was definitely thick.
Those were the days, right? And I will say that you touched briefly about that experience on the board, and along with Electra, and somewhat later than my friendship with Electra, Marilyn Duenskas proved to be a great mentor. Now, not only is she a tremendous and energetic and amazing person and painter, but she went to great pains to explain to me how this whole watercolor board thing worked and so forth. And the few years that I spent on the board, I believe she was chairman that whole time, or at least a good bit of the time. And working with her was, I will say, a rare education. She had a profound effect on the direction of my thinking about groups, about institutions, about how the larger, more social entities of the art world worked. And she had a great practical way about her. She didn't suffer fools gladly, but she also didn't suffer lazy people gladly. And I found that really energizing. I was afraid of her, frankly.
Yeah, she's quite a pistol. Even today at 88, I mean, I knew she was going to enter in our show this year. She became our first Lifetime Achievement Award winner last year. So
Yeah, well deserved.
We came up with an award, and she made our 75th annual exhibition that much more special because she invited her family from all over the country to come to see her receive that award. And she can hardly see. Her hands are she can't even hold a brush very well anymore, but she cranked out a piece. She entered this year's exhibition. And I had a few years back, I created a chairman's show, just a secondary show, just to keep people engaged and grow our volunteerism. And I said, we'd like to have you come in. She says, I'll ship you 4 pieces. I'll ship you my Mary Jane Bigler piece. And then she came up from Tennessee. Her daughter, they flew in together and they spent the weekend, and she was surrounded by her students. And she says, you got me excited again. So she's been painting ever since. And she calls me all the time out of the blue. And what do you think of this? And what do you think of that? And I go, man, you got so much energy. I hope I have it when I'm your age.
Oh boy. Yeah, she's an amazing woman. And I got a short email from her last week. But I think about Marilyn, I think about her contributions, which were many to both the society and to me personally as an artist and so forth. But perhaps the most long-lived and salient contribution she made, to my understanding, was that more than perhaps anyone else that I met from that era, at least watercolors from that era, Marilyn understood that painting was an active investigation, that it wasn't about production, producing, rote pieces, that each painting would reveal something if you worked hard enough, if you looked hard enough, and if you were willing to see that relinquishing control gave you a better result than keeping everything all, tight and pat and so forth. Marilyn was, in my mind, one of the best in terms of ability painters who let's see, I'm trying to think of the word now, who was sort of an emblem for that idea of investigation. Now, we all meet that idea in various guises. Most of the great painters from the 60s and 70s agreed with that and so forth. So I'm not suggesting that it was an original idea with Marilyn, rather that she lived that idea. And it obviously shows in her work, which seems never to rest.
Right. Well, we've got a few minutes. I want to talk more about your art for people to kind of understand your process. I've looked at a lot of images. Again, I don't know why I can't see these, but you are sharing your screen, but nobody can see it, right? That. I'm trying to get to your work here. Without killing this.
Yeah, right now I got a blank screen.
Yeah.
Except I see you up there.
I'm just trying to get to so I can see them. You had a series from, and again, these are large pieces. They were 6 foot, 8 foot pieces from different locations that you've been around the world.
Mm-hmm.
And one was, let me see if I can bring this right. There we go. Okay. One was the Florentine series. And it seems like there's a lot of stuff happening in that piece.
I'm not seeing it.
Yeah, I know you're not. I'm trying to bring it up so I see it. And it's the very gold looking piece with a lot of angles and lines and just a lot of texture.
Well, following Marilyn's example of art and painting being an act of inquiry, my career, I worked in very long and some would say ponderous series, investigating a single idea. The one you're referring to, which I actually can't see, was part of a much larger series called the Florentine series, which was essentially taking, let's see how I can describe this, taking the feel of the Pitti Palace in Florence, the coffered ceilings, the various artworks, and obviously, I'm not talking about Raphael now, but certainly his portraits in the Pitti Palace are amazing. But taking the feel of the Pitti Palace and translating that feel into a lush kind of geometry. Did that make any sense at all?
Yeah, there's a lot of geometric shapes in your work, very linear. After I started looking at some of your work, because I haven't seen it in a while, and I'm kind of doing some of the same things with watercolor. For me, it's more architectural than what you're doing, but you had one red painting that you entered in the show. Let's see if I have a title for that one.
Sure, I remember that one.
and it glowed. It's called Sun Red.
Right, right. And that will allow me actually to, I think, to make a better sense than I did with the Florentine series, which were very sensual pieces, very textural, very lush paintings. But the New Zealand paintings actually came from a single experience in nature. My wife and I were out on a place called Already Beach, which is the very, very south tip of the South Island of New Zealand. From there, you can smell the ice of the Antarctic, and the sun has a very particular quality, a quality unlike, almost a hallucinatory quality, unlike light quality that I've met anywhere else. Not Africa, not Italy, not the Southwest, et cetera, et cetera. And so I did a long series of paintings that were essentially inspired, if you want to use that word, by being present with that sun. They weren't pictures of the sun. They were meant to represent how it felt to be in the presence of that rather amazing sun. And truth be told, all of my work has come directly from observation of the physical world that's then translated through the lens of my own particular preferences and vision. So I don't think I've ever painted a painting which didn't have somewhere deep down the line an actual physical reference. And in the case of that painting, it was the experience of being on that particular beach on a very windy day where the sun was as hazy and I would say crazy as you can imagine. I also sent you a couple of the Boku series, which came from Ethiopia,
Right.
which are not a direct reference to, but which allude to what several tribes in southern Ethiopia refer to as a talking stick. It's very much like a peace pipe for the American Indians. Excuse me. And that talking stick, the boku, is passed from tribe member to tribe member. And that tribe member that holds the stick can speak, and the tribe member that possesses the stick is the leader. And so I like that idea. I saw several of them. They're not as ornate as what I came up with, but I actually thought of those long, very narrow verticals of the Boku series as emblems of that particular artifact. Does that make any sense?
Yep. Yeah.
So they didn't just spring out of my brain or whatever. They actually had a reference in the physical world. I don't think I've ever not done that.
So for people that are kind of new with watercolor in general, or they're new as artists, you've exhibited. Did you exhibit mainly because you were teaching, or did you go out and search galleries to show your work? What was your process of getting some exposure?
Very good. Really excellent question, and not one that I anticipated, but it is something that's in the compendium of my fairly important memories. And King Calkins recognized the impulse in me fairly early when I was thinking of going to graduate school at Montana State in Bozeman. What King said, very frankly, is, and I'm going to paraphrase, sadly I can't quote him, he said, "Pete, where are you going to show? You've always shown, you like showing, and it seems to drive your art. So where in Bozeman, Montana, do you expect to show your work?" And I didn't have an answer for that. I went out to Montana, I looked around, I loved it. I was into mountaineering at the time. It seemed like a great place to go. But the truth of King's words came back pretty powerfully when I got back to Ann Arbor. And it became clear, as much as I might like Bozeman, Montana, that it wasn't going to be a fairly fertile ground for my own painting. But to answer your question directly, and to me, this is really a kind of bedrock issue. To me, painting is an act of communication. It's a very direct, in a way, kind of communication one-to-one. And I think I believe this because I grew up surrounded, almost in a museum of paintings. Lived with them day in and day out. They were always there. And so a world where there weren't paintings was rather alien to me. But the paintings that hung in my parents' house were very much engaged in a kind of communication with me as I was growing up, simply by looking at them, finding new things to look at, remembering things. They were a jumping off point for lots of imagination. And so when I paint, although I'm not necessarily conscious of it in the frontal lobes, I'm always attempting to make something that will communicate on a fairly intimate, sincere level to another human being. Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the point of it. And like you, I've been to museums all over the world, until it's coming out of my head. But the engagement, the profound engagement that one has, say with a Zurbarán crucifixion in the Prado, that you sit for an hour trying to absorb and being dwarfed by. For me, that means and meant more than a lecture in an art history room, although I certainly didn't ignore those, or I did, but I shouldn't have.
What were the issues of the day when you were on the board?
Oh boy. Let me broaden that out. Let me broaden that out a little bit, because let me say what were the issues of the day, and they were certainly present in the board. As a matter of fact, I think that the primary issue that I felt plagued by and driven by was an issue that Grace Hartigan, when she came to jury the watercolor show, and I discussed it at huge length on the drive back to Ann Arbor from Detroit, was originality. And Grace talked on and on about Bill de Kooning, who she, as you all probably know, was very, what shall we say, close to. And I'm going to paraphrase Grace. I was very young when I was talking to her. She was not. She just had her second hip replacement. She reminded me a little bit, or maybe it's the other way around, of Mary Jane Bigler in a way. Now, Grace was a really tough woman, and I loved her for that. But when I brought up the subject of originality, she just kind of laughed. We're in my father's car driving back from Detroit. And she said, any painter who worries about originality doesn't need to. In other words, if you're thinking about it, you're not original. And I that stayed with me for a very long time. And I think it made, and perhaps, excuse me, and perhaps makes more sense back then in the age of heroic painting than it does now. As a matter of fact, it probably sounds kind of quaint. But back in the days when the shadows of the abexers were very, very long, and their lives and philosophies were very much present in art departments, the issue of originality was much talked about. And I think Grace's point was that no amount of academic chatter is going to make an individual original. That's an innate quality. Can't be learned.
Yeah.
And I think that's very, very true. Sorry, that was pretty long-winded.
No, This is all great stuff, and I think our audience appreciated this kind of discussion. I mean, I haven't. We don't get into these that much, and I've been trying to start the old art exchange. I don't know if you were involved in any of those back with Electra and Paula.
Yeah,
and,
absolutely.
And that was awesome. And you know, I was fortunate to have King at my house before he left, and those are just neat things. But you know, if there's any questions, people feel free to put them in the chat window, and we can discuss it. And just a couple of comments that aren't technically related. You know, Lisa DeLuca's on the call here, and she came a little after, but she was good friends with Lulu Nestor, and I think Lulu probably got her involved. And so she had Kingsley. She graduated in '82. She had Tammany, Pappas, and Pappas. If you remember John Pappas.
Oh, John is one of my favorite human beings.
He is still alive and still doing commissioned sculpture work. I had him here at the house a few months ago. His daughter brought him over, and it was just going to be for a few minutes. He stayed for lunch, and we had a 3-hour conversation. And he just got and I posted on the Michigan Watercolor site. I think I did. Eastern just did an interview with him about him and his work. So he's doing great. He's the only mentor I think I still have left from the good old days. Let's see. The question here was Carl Lopez, a section of fine art artist who created post office murals in Plymouth and Birmingham. It may not be the same guy. Looking at his.
What was the name again?
What's that?
I didn't hear the part about the name of the artist that did.
Carl Lopez. Carl Lopez.
Oh, that would have been Carlos. Yes. Yeah.
Oh, that would have been him, huh?
That would have been a WPA project, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah, I actually I put that one up. This is Cheryl, and there was section of fine arts, almost WPA, but it was only in federal buildings, and there was more qualifications to become a section of fine arts artist than a WPA artist. I did one of my masters. I did a project, a thesis on section of fine art artists. I thought it was him.
Okay.
Yes. My recollection suggests that numerous faculty from U of M, and now Carlos also taught in Detroit, and I don't have his chronology in front of me, but I know he did that. Numerous faculty at U of M, and I'm sure Wright State, during the WPA did murals. My dad did 4 or 5 of them in schoolhouses and post offices and that kind of thing. I think they're all destroyed now. And it wouldn't surprise me a bit if Carlos did a mural in Birmingham, because he was as familiar in Detroit as he was in Ann Arbor. Now, remember, he died in 1953. So he was very much just in that immediate post-war era.
Yeah. So I think the Wilt we were talking about that taught drawing was Ellen Wilt. So she may not have been the wife of Richard Wilt.
No, she was.
I think.
Oh,
I
she
call
was.
her Bonnie because that was her nickname.
Okay. Yeah, I remember her
it's-
very well.
Oh my gosh, she's one of my favorite people.
Yeah, Lisa Tennant had Ellen, and she had Pappas as well, Igor. Well, I had Igor for commercial art, and he said, you know, this isn't for you. You should take watercolor. And of course, he was teaching it.
Oh, Igor was a great guy.
Yeah. I got a photo with them at the last exhibition of the Michigan Watercolor that he was in. He won an award, and I think he died a few months later after that. It was at the BBAC the last time we were there, so that was special.
Yeah,
Peter,
I took three of his classes at Eastern, and I think that as a foundation for watercolor understanding and technique, Igor was a master. He was a very gentle teacher, very smart guy, and of course, obviously, an amazing painter with a very, except for one period when he was going through some personal difficulties. Generally, Igor's touch was one of the most delicate touches with a brush that I've ever been around.
Yeah, I still remember the techniques that he taught, just the wave of the brush and this twist this way and twist that way.
Right.
Just to create a different line. And that's the way I paint today. I won't just draw a straight line. It's got a wave and bend, and even holding a crayon that way. But Peter, this was great. I'm glad we finally had a chance to talk.
Well, thank you, Rocco. Appreciate it.
And this is recorded. So like I said, I'm going to send some of Peter's artwork along with the recorded session where you can see it, and go from there. And I'll try to figure out why this time I wasn't able to share images where I've been able to in the past. So I don't know.
Technology.
Different camera. I don't know, but we'll work it out.
Well, thank you very much. Before we close, I just want to say thanks for the opportunity. It's great to catch up. You've brought back some very fond memories for me. Although I'm way out in the Southwest now, the Michigan Watercolor Society remains quite dear to my heart.
Well, I'm a chief therapist, and I think, I mean, I get a lot of therapy out of this. And so I enjoy doing it. And again, like I said earlier in the introductions, if you know of others that you think that we could all benefit from a conversation with, feel free to let me know. It doesn't take a lot of work, especially as unorganized as I am. We just go for it. And so thank you, guys. I appreciate it.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Have a great day.
Thanks, Rocco.
Thank you, Rocco. Thanks for doing that.
You bet.